one of Lee's great abilities was to take the measure of the opposing commanders. There are some other things that really don't jive with the history. And one of them is that Robert E. Lee did not automatically transform into the incarnation of the lost cause after his death in 1870. Prior to 1890, Lee, quote, was not yet what he would become, the almost godlike hero of the South. One of all the legends about the Civil War and its aftermath, I am pretty sure that I can say this without controversy. One of the most problematic is probably Robert E. Lee. We would examine the way in which he is thought of and how that's impacted a lot of different things, in particular, how Union veterans themselves have been regarded. And I'll start with two of the most celebrated officers in the North. Major General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, professor of rhetoric and modern languages at Bowdoin, who did something very unusual on sabbatical. He went to war, and he became one of the Army of the Potomac's finest generals. And as he was awaiting the surrender, quote, I saw a commanding form, superbly mounted, richly accoutred, of imposing bearing, noble countenance, with an expression of deep sadness overmastered by deeper strength. It was none other than Robert E. Lee. I sat immobile with a certain awe and admiration. And that's a pretty fascinating description of someone that he had opposed with tremendous courage all the way through the acceptance of the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. It was very akin to Grant's recounting of what occurred at Appomattox in his memoirs, where Grant called Lee, quote, a man of much dignity, dressed in a full uniform which was entirely new, unquote, while he himself, the general-in-chief of all the Union armies, wore, quote, rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private with the straps of a lieutenant general. I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high, and of faultless form. Now, Lee was undoubtedly an impressive figure with undeniable personal magnetism. But what's missing from these glowing, often almost mythic descriptions is a stark reality that Lee, the son of a celebrated Revolutionary War leader and governor of Virginia, nephew of a signer of Declaration of Independence, and the husband of a great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, was ultimately defeated by a tanner's son in muddy boots, leading an army of soldiers held in contempt by Lee's own men. And the historian Alan T. Nolan examined the symbiosis between this lionized general and the Confederate States of America and why they both were doomed. Quote, Lee entered and fought the war with sectional partisanship, a Southern aristocrat's feeling about the inferiority of Northern people, a zealous commitment to the Southern cause as truly just, anger over the North's conduct of the war, and a belief in slavery. Now, what I'm going to focus on in this talk and what I focused on in my book is what the American volunteer soldier felt about Lee. Because frankly, that's what I'm really interested in the most. Because they're the ones who opposed him for 4 years. They're the ones who fought the war. And one of Lee's great abilities was to take the measure of the opposing commanders. And as you know, he had his way with the commanders of the Army of the Potomac until he met the newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, George Gordon Meade, at Gettysburg. But I believe that Lee mistook the poor leadership the Army of the Potomac received as somehow a deficiency in the soldiers themselves. And that frankly proved disastrous for the Confederacy. And I think an aspect of that is it's quite possible, indeed likely, that Lee neither understood the Union citizen soldiers because they were very different from his own men. And I'm not sure he truly grasped what they had come to represent over the 4 years of the war. Now, conversely, how did Northern veterans regard him? And I found a very telling document. In February 1866, the Soldiers and Sailors National Union League adopted unanimously with great applause a preamble and 4 resolutions about Lee. Believing they spoke for their comrades, the League expressed views on a man who they believed personified the Confederacy. They wanted Lee tried for treason. They denounced him as a traitor to the United States and its flag and an enemy of African Americans. They vehemently objected to the idea of returning any portion of Arlington to Lee, which of course had become the National Cemetery, and they held him in great part responsible for the treatment of Union prisoners. Whether or not this was just and all exclaimed, the contemporary opinions of a large group of Union veterans on the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia and the general-in-chief of the armies of the Confederate States couldn't be plainer. Unlike some of their officers, including Grant, the men who fought the rebels on thousands of battlefields were not inclined to be professionally forgiving when it came to Robert E. Lee. And not only that, the statement I just read to you is strikingly discordant with remaining prevalent concepts about Robert E. Lee. There are some other things that really don't jive with the history. And one of them is that Robert E. Lee did not automatically transform into the incarnation of the lost cause after his death in 1870. As Thomas L. Connolly observed, prior to 1890, Lee, quote, was not yet what he would become, the almost godlike hero of the South, nor was he yet considered a national symbol of nobility of the Southern experience, unquote. But that changed. So as Connolly observed, by 1910, Lee was a national hero. Now, it is very interesting that many Northerners, while critical of Lee, they tended to tread very lightly. And in 1889, the National Tribune, the Union veteran-centric newspaper, while they strongly opposed making his birthday a legal holiday, noting the fact that he had been both educated and served in the U.S. Army at public expense, unlike such Southerners as Major General George H. Thomas, and that he had violated his oath and became the leader of one of the leaders of the rebellion. Yet at the same time, quote, the purity of General Lee's private character and the nobility of his personality will never be questioned. His bravery and soldierly qualities will go down in history unblemished. That is not the way the Union soldier looked at Lee. They never held him in thrall. They objected to his growing mythical status. And it is of great irony that a law that was enacted during the Civil War would give Union veterans their last best chances to both individually and collectively express how they felt about Lee and the Confederacy in general. And this is the story that most people don't know about how Lee's statue ended up in the Capitol. The law was passed on July 2nd, 1864. It established National Statuary Hall. The President of the United States was empowered to ask every state in the Union, which of course included all the southern states, to provide up to 2 statues of deceased citizens of the state who were, quote, illustrious for their historic renown or distinguished civic or military services that were deemed worthy of national commemoration, unquote. And these would then be placed in the House of Representatives' Old Hall. When this law was enacted, and when Abraham Lincoln signed it, no one could have dreamed that one of the leading states in the South would ultimately choose to fulfill its sculpture allotment as they did. So in January 1903, Virginia State Senator Don P. Halsey proposed a bill to commission a new statue of Robert E. Lee to join the one in Statuary Hall of George Washington that was already there. And anticipating that this would be passed, they planned to meet with Secretary of State Hay to find out whether Congress would allow this to be placed within the Capitol if the federal government objected to the individual chosen. Now, even though the concept of the statue for Lee in the Capitol was well received by Virginians overall, it was not uniformly praised. Matter of fact, the Richmond Times was particularly unenthusiastic about this, and they expressed concern that Northerners would feel that the Old Dominion was, quote, trying to force General Lee upon them. They then added a rather peculiar reservation, quote, our only fear is that someday the North will appropriate him as it has appropriated George Washington. Robert E. Lee is Virginia's hero and the South's hero, and we are unwilling even to divide honors with the North. Well, within 2 days, the National Tribune, which was aghast at such an idea, dispelled any such apprehensions. They reported that the work would begin on the Lee statue once the funds came in. They emphatically stated that any efforts to do so, to place his statue in the National Gallery, would be a desecration. 2 weeks later, after they made that first report, their disgust hadn't lessened one iota, as they frankly stated that to place Lee's likeness in the Statuary Hall, quote, would give it a new character entirely. and make it a shrine for those who worship the lost cause, the thought is intolerable. As I'm sure you're not surprised by, the reaction from Northern veterans and their supporters was swift in coming. The first annual encampment of one of the Grand Army of the Republic organizations, and they were structured in state departments. Encampments would meet every year, or sometimes twice a year. The first one that met was, ironically enough, the Department of the Potomac. They unanimously adopted resolutions of protest against, quote, one of the chief exemplars of treason being exalted in high places. The Women's Relief Corps, the female auxiliary, was even more against the concept of Lee being placed within the national capital, that they would, quote, never consent to have treason thus condoned and disloyalty thus exalted and glorified for the emulation of generations yet unborn. So it was abundantly clear that this was going to create tremendous problems. February 14th, Virginia's Senate passes this bill by a 32-2 vote, along with legislation to fund the statue. And what's really interesting is that the governor did not sign the bill, even though it went into law 5 days automatically without his signature. He knew the firestorm this was going to cause. And the Richmond Times-Dispatch reported that already Republican members of Congress from the states in the West and North were being overwhelmed with protests from members of the Grand Army of the Republic and individuals, with one congressman saying he had no idea that the opposition would be that strong. Now, that was in the beginning, when the statue was theoretical, hadn't been built yet. And the governor didn't sign the bill. He felt that General Lee would have protested against this, not because the governor was not a tremendous admirer of Lee, but he regarded putting a statue of him in the Capitol as unnecessary, unwise, and inexpedient. You can just imagine what the response was from Northern veterans, including several at the time serving in Congress. For example, 2 Northern veterans from the Midwest, Iowa Representative John Lacey, suggested that the next thing that Virginia legislators want to do would be to put in the Capitol statues of the captors of John Brown, under the guise of having performed a patriotic service. Going one step further, Representative Edgar Weeks of Minnesota, also a Union veteran, said that the Brown statue should be erected on federal grounds in Richmond itself. Yet another Union veteran, John Q. Evans of the 5th Wisconsin, asked in the National Tribune, if a statue of Robert E. Lee is placed in the national capital, wouldn't it be appropriate to place 2 other people along with him, Benedict Arnold and Judas Iscariot? I have to say, this set the tone for what went on over the next several years. The state of Virginia appropriated the money. They contracted with sculptor Edward Valentine, and they put together a commission to get the statue built, get it approved, and to be placed in the Capitol, while over the next several months, individual Grand Army posts and individual departments, West Virginia and Kansas themselves, all adamantly opposing the placement of a statue of Robert Lee in the national capital. Yet a former commander-in-chief of the Grand Army had a different take. Quote, 40 years have passed since the Civil War. The wounds have all nearly healed. The war with Spain solidified the country. Let it remain that way. If Virginia intends to honor their great son, the Grand Army should not try to oppose him. Scores of former Confederates have been sent to the Senate and House by these states. The rank and file did not accept in any way that rationale. So not only the Grand Army of the Republic was outraged, the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, MULLIS, which were all officers, they also adopted condemnatory resolutions, all addressed to the Grand Army of the Republic. And the Minneapolis Journal reported that the Grand Army intended to petition Congress to amend the law that would provide that no state could ask for a statue of any man who had borne arms against his country. Yet, when the Grand Army met in their national encampment that year in San Francisco, even though a significant percentage of delegates adamantly opposed the Lee statue, there was no resolution of any type protesting the statue coming into the Capitol. That was completely different than what happened 2 months later when another Union veterans organization, the Union Veteran League, bitterly opposed the statue of Lee being placed, and they did enact their own protesting and denouncing the plan of him being placed in the Capitol, seeing it as, quote, an insult to the Union soldiers now living and to the memory of the soldier dead. So it was bad enough for Union veterans en masse that a statue of Robert E. Lee would appear. That what they did not know was that the state of Virginia intended to have him clad in a full Confederate general's uniform. Now, the logic of that, which frankly was mind-boggling, came from Chairman Halsey, who had proposed the original legislation. He said the decision would be he had to be in his uniform because his great claim to have a statue of him in the Capitol was because he had been the general-in-chief of the armies of the Confederacy, because his only other achievement they could possibly have looked at was his presidency of Washington Lee University, and that would not have made him eligible to be placed in Statuary Hall. So 1903 closes with the rank and file of the Grand Army outraged the idea of a statue of Robert Lee being placed in the national capital. Then the issue went dormant. But then in 1909, it came back with a fury when people found out what the statue was going to look like, and they had had years to process this information. So in 1909, Virginia requested formal acceptance of the Lee statue along with a new replica of the Washington statue, and it was placed within Statuary Hall, within a few yards of Generals James Shields of Illinois and Phil Kearny of New Jersey, clad, not surprisingly, in Union blue. And the statue itself of Lee was in bronze, mounted on marble, towering over George Washington, even though he actually was not as tall as George Washington. The mission of the National Tribune became keeping people informed about what happened with the statue and what they perceived their mission was going to be was providing themselves as a forum for Union veterans to express their opinion about the statue of Robert E. Lee clad in Confederate general's uniform in the Capitol. And I can tell you, having studied every issue of the National Tribune from beginning of 1909 through the time the Grand Army met in the national encampment, that we're talking hundreds of articles, letters of protest, of every kind of description, some of which I'll report to you. The themes were common. And again, it is very striking to look at what the men who had fought against the Army of Northern Virginia and fought against the Confederacy, their views on Robert E. Lee, as opposed to still commonly held views now. They were unanimous in their perception as Robert E. Lee as a traitor, guilty of treason, who they felt perhaps should have been executed for treason. They compared him to one of the most common comparisons made to Benedict Arnold. And matter of fact, several of the men said, if we had tried, if New York State had chosen Benedict Arnold as their statue, because of course every state was entitled to two, they asked how long do they think Congress would have allowed a statue of Benedict Arnold to remain within a Capitol, and they estimated it would be about an hour. Lee's statue, although never officially accepted by Congress, was in Statuary Hall, and as you may or may not be aware, remained so much longer than people realize, which I'll mention as the talk starts to come to an end. There were several aspects of what the Grand Army, Northern veterans, and people who had not fought in the war felt. They thought that Virginia's desire for a Lee statue was very much akin to, quote, cramming slavery down the throats of those who didn't like it and making all the rest of the country virtually slave states. This was a common theme. And other themes came in with it, because at the time, there was also a statue that was dedicated to Henry Wirz, the only man convicted and executed for war crimes during the Civil War. And of course, he was the commandant of Andersonville Prison. You can imagine how the perception was of a statue being dedicated to Wirz. They mentioned Nathan Bedford Forrest, who by all accounts and assessment by historians had murdered in cold blood African-American troops and their commanders who had surrendered at Fort Pillow. People hadn't forgotten this. And reconciliation, which had been going on all the way through Reconstruction and the years after, including the imposition of Jim Crow and the lost cause mentality taking hold, not only in the South, but also in the North. The resentment of Northern veterans, and again, this is throughout my book, this is one of the common themes, is that Northern veterans fought a second war, the war of emancipation and the war to save the Republic. But there was another war before it, and that second war was equality for all Americans. And white and black Union veterans were at the forefront of that and fought together for that. And then even though survivors were dying out tremendously during the time that the Lee statue was being considered and placed within the Capitol, there was still several hundred thousand Union veterans still alive. And so many of them talked about how that desecration, and that's how they viewed it, of Lee being placed within the Capitol, that they felt that the men who had died already were lucky not to have lived to see this. They felt that they could not believe that they had lived long enough to see a statue of Robert E. Lee placed within the Capitol of the United States. So what ended up happening was that the rank and file, and the thing about the Grand Army of the Republic, it was an organization of the rank and file. Many of the commanders in chief were not officers. They had been enlisted men, which was very different than the Mallas, the Loyal Legion. But what they found was that the former commanders in chief, several of them, were opposing the opposition to the Lee statue. And they felt, as Samuel Burdett, one example, he felt that if the statue was removed, he feared, quote, lighting a flame that would set a whole firmament on fire. Now, a legitimate concern, but he then added this statement about Robert E. Lee. Lee was the second great figure in the greatest epic this country or the world has ever seen. I have never believed that Lee's heart was in the fight, on the side where he offered himself. He was the victim of a cult which had taught the Southern people that there was not and should not be a nation, but that to the state the supreme allegiance belonged. This is classic reconciliation cant. You could just imagine how Union veterans perceive this. Another former commander-in-chief of the Grand Army, James Tanner, also objected to the objections to the statue for a different reason, because it was under the law. And since they had fought and risked their lives in defense of the law, there was nothing that opposition could do, whether or not they agree with it. Lee's statue makes no motion, but it stands there. It is eternal witness of the power, the magnanimity and glory of the great nation which he tried to destroy and it failed. I say let it stand. However, Northern veterans had no intention of letting somebody else speak for them. And their outrage deepened as their former commanders of their very organization were opposing their multitudinous resolutions that the statue be removed. And they came from all over the United States. with one exception, which I'll get to later. Now, there was one particular encampment, one particular state that was going to be the bellwether, and that was New York. And New York, at its encampment, did pass a resolution unanimously opposing the Lee statue being placed over the objections of James Tanner. People were watching this. It's New York, the newspapers were based there, and someone started getting very nervous when New York State passed a resolution opposing this. And that person was President Taft. He was very concerned about what New York State's department was doing. So he asked George Wickersham, the Attorney General, to render an opinion on whether the statue that the state of Virginia had submitted could be placed, officially placed, within the national capital. So Wickersham had an opinion, which was then published with no notation other than the decision itself at the end of July, with extensive press coverage. And Wickersham immediately said he'd read what had gone on in New York State and Tanner's communications on it. And he acknowledged that at the time the bill was passed, again, 1864, in the midst of the Civil War, it was highly unlikely that anyone could have anticipated that a state in the Union would ask for a statue, would choose a statue of someone who was actively in rebellion against the United States. And that was reasonable. That was absolutely reasonable, which most veterans didn't oppose. But that's not where Wickersham stopped. He then said this: Robert E. Lee has come to be generally regarded as typifying not only all that was best in the cause to which at the behest of his native state he gave his services, but also the most loyal and unmurmuring acceptance of the complete overthrow of that cause. He declared that Virginia's designation, quote, as one illustrative for distinguished military service is therefore natural that Lee be in his Confederate uniform. He said that any unsuccessful attempts to destroy the Union would then be forgiven and should provoke no opposition. So he then said that there was no way that legally they could stop it. And he said, therefore, under the existing law, it could be placed in the Statuary Hall. Now, again, his decision on the law itself was not surprising, but nobody expected what the National Tribune called his unnecessary obiter dicta about the Supreme Court, which sounded exactly like the Dred Scott decision. And as they said, it's unfortunate he did not confine himself to an explicit statement of the law. This is what raised absolute outrage among Union veterans. And it is striking when you read what they wrote. And one of the first people who protested was Lawrence Collins, who was the former National Judge Advocate General for the Grand Army and the past commander of the Minnesota Commandery. He stated that Wickersham, quote, had absolutely no business to pass on the ethical question involved. You might as well put a Confederate flag in the Capitol and say that it stood for all that was best and ideal in the Confederate cause as to put General Lee's statue there in a Confederate uniform and justify the act on those grounds. General Lee stands for a cause that thousands of Union soldiers gave their lives to overthrow, even more than the man, the uniform typifies that cause. And this was the tone that so many of the men wrote about. Now, another individual, Lieutenant Thomas Sturgis, 57th Massachusetts, he had another take, which I find very interesting. And I think he was probably absolutely right. He felt Wickersham and scores of others who had not fought in the war, quote, who only know it as a matter of history, completely misunderstand the feeling that existed between the soldiers of the two armies and fails to grasp in the slightest degree the principle that animates the vast majority of surviving Union soldiers and their sympathizers throughout the North, for whom I speak, in opposition to the Lee statue. Wickersham talks of magnanimity, forgiveness, complete surrender, etc., all of which are foreign to the question as we see it, unquote. By putting Lee in his Confederate uniform in the hall, quote, "Virginia does so not to commemorate his noble character and civic services, why else the uniform, but conspicuously his services and effort to destroy the nation. Against this, we shall continue to protest as a degradation of our national ideals." He then mentioned something else, his concern that a lot of the soldiers felt that if the Lee statue was allowed, what would prevent other Confederate icons, such as Mississippi's Jefferson Davis or Tennessee's Nathan Bedford Forrest, who, as I mentioned, who had condoned, if not actively advocated, the massacre of African American prisoners at Fort Pillow. So this went on for months. And in the interest of time, I won't read these. You can get the general gist. For example, the department commander of Utah, Thomas Lundy, he was so outraged at Wickersham and the support of some of the former commanders-in-chief of the Grand Army, he suggested that all the sculptures that the loyal states had submitted to the Statuary Hall be sent back to their respective capitals. Then every one of the statues from the rebel generals and statesmen should be sent to Statuary Hall. It would then be called the Hall of Horrors, and Lundy would ask that a sign be put up saying, quote, "Here are the men that tried to destroy the Union and perpetuate human slavery," placed over the entrance so that other generations would know where to place them historically. I must point out that this passion, pride, and defiance of aging Union veterans against Lee's new place of honor was clearly a manifestation of undeniable despair, because it was deepened by their angst over the causes for which they had fought so long ago and their legacy. You've got to put all of this in the context of reconciliation and Jim Crow and the failure of Reconstruction. And by the day, Union veterans had seen a war that was based, pure and simple, in white supremacy and slavery, had been reimagined as a war about states' rights, where slavery was not even mentioned, where the service of 200,000 men of color in the armies and navies of the Union was now subject to almost a national amnesia, where the whole teaching of the Civil War had taken on a completely different tone, all of which, and again, that's what my book is all about, all of which the men of the Union, black and white, bitterly resented and fought against. This was the culmination of that, the idea that Robert E. Lee would have a place of honor in the national capital. And as I mentioned, it makes us, quote, "It makes us old Union soldiers almost feel our work was in vain, even though our patriotism is as strong as ever." Another GR member wrote in from Tennessee, quote, "The South may eulogize Leader of the Skies, but history will prove that what is written, and all that can be said in the way of apology for his acts cannot wipe out the stain." So as this was all going on, it not only troubled the surviving Union veterans that Americans who were born after the Civil War did not understand the profound resentment of this, but when their own people, their own former past commanders were sanctioning this, they were apoplectic. There's just no other way to put that. And I'll kind of skip over to what happened as they came towards the national meeting. Now, the Grand Army Republic was not the only veterans organization in the United States. It was the most prominent one and the largest, but it wasn't the only one. As I mentioned, there were others that were looking at this. Now, as the national encampment approached in Atlantic City, the Grand Army was facing its biggest issue since they'd refused to draw a color line 2 decades earlier, which was frankly the peak of the Grand Army. They were the only national organization of nearly its prestige and nearly its size that refused to draw a color line in 19th century America. And there was going to be a showdown this time in 1910 about whether or not the Grand Army would protest the placement of Lee's statue. And again, I analyzed all the newspapers from January to September 19th. There were no less than 133 separate post-protesting, auxiliary groups, individuals, and other organizations. In addition, many past high-level officials, up until and including some former commanders themselves, had all opposed this. And when they were getting ready to go to Atlantic City, their membership was telling them that they got to oppose this at the National Convention. Now, I mentioned that there was one part of the Grand Army that had not protested. Not one department in a former Confederate state protested against the placement of the Lee statue. So even though the rest of the country did, West, Midwest, East, and border states, obviously including the Department of the Potomac, not one former state that fought against the armies of the Union protested against the Lee statue. So what happened, and again, I want to leave time for questions. What happened was that they put together a committee to take a look at an omnibus resolution proposed by the Department of Indiana, where they would protest and ask for congressional removal of the Lee statue. Its chief advocate was a very formidable man by the name of William A. Ketchum, who had been the Indiana Attorney General and a high-ranking member of the Grand Army. He was voted down, but he insisted on presenting his resolution to the entire body of the Grand Army. But unfortunately, what happened, it was the last day. He thought there were going to be 900 veterans there. There were only 250 there, even less. He felt they could not vote on such a resolution because it would not represent the majority of the Grand Army, because it was just too small a number. But they ended up having a voice vote. And I will point out that not only was he protesting the Lee statue, he also protesting and demanded the removal of the portrait of Jefferson Davis on the battleship Mississippi, and that there should be nothing, including using the Confederate battle flag, which was being used, in any federal sites, because that was something that was also a great vote of contention with the Grand Army. The voice vote was extremely close, but Ketchum and his resolution was defeated. And it was, the voice vote, like I said, was only about 20 men difference. And when people interviewed those who had voted against Ketchum's resolution, they didn't disagree with Ketchum, but they felt that to do that, to protest the statue would create problems for the Grand Army, particularly those who were in the Grand Army in the former Confederate states. So even though there was tremendous bitterness and the discussion went on for hours, but by the time they voted, they did not pass any resolution. The three former commanders-in-chief crowed about this. And this is what they had to say, that they perceived that this was the correct vote, and that, for example, Tanner stuck with what he said, that was the law. Just trying to scroll down here. Yeah, Tanner, who could not stop his own department, New York, from adopting a resolution, had great success. He said Congress will never repeal the law. It will never send the statute back to Virginia. It has never been accepted by Congress. There isn't any likelihood that would happen. We might as well drop it. Torrance was much more dismissive, calling it a tempest in a teapot, saying that the statute belongs there, the Attorney General. And he also said that there was not one reputable newspaper in the United States that opposed the statute, which could not have been more insulting to the National Tribune, which, even though it was not the official organ of the Grand Army Republic, it was the newspaper, and it was a marvelous newspaper for Union veterans. He could not have been more insulting when it came to that. So what happened when they closed the encampment was they played taps, and the refusal of the Grand Army to pass any sort of resolution opposing the Lee statue really signaled the end of any kind of influence the Grand Army the Republic had had. It betrayed its own principles and traditions. As I mentioned, 20 years before, it had risen to its greatest heights by refusing to draw a color line. 20 years later, it didn't display any of the courage it had displayed either in battle or in peace. And it became essentially a mostly irrelevant organization as time went on. And they did try the next year to again bring up the issue of a resolution, but that did not pass. Unlike almost every other major union veteran organization, the National Association of Naval Veterans, the Union Veterans Legion, the Union Veterans Union, several of its own departments, the Grand Army never passed a resolution against the Lee statue. On Memorial Day, 1911, amidst flag-festooned statues of Northern soldiers, a Capitol employee from Virginia adorned the Lee bronze, the Lee statue, with a floral wreath. The flowers went untouched until a Capitol policeman saw and immediately removed the flowers, saying, quote, "That was not the time to decorate Lee's statue," and other remarks of similar tenure. The Times Dispatch further reported that the stories getting out would almost certainly ensure that officer being fired for his, quote, overzealousness. I will close by pointing out that in April 2020, the Virginia General Assembly approved an act to remove the Lee statue from the US Capitol. It was removed, and it is being replaced by a statue to Barbara Rose Johns, who will now represent the state of Virginia in the Capitol. I will point out it took more than a century for the Lee statue of him clad in full Confederate uniform to be removed from the national Capitol, even though it had never been formally accepted. I'll stop here, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
When the Lee statue was removed, where did it end up?
I believe it's in another museum, not your museum. I believe it's another museum in Richmond. I think I've got that. And you know, this is such a major issue now about where statues go and what happens, and which I think is a very important issue. If you're asking my opinion, what I think they should be done, I think statues such as the Lee statue, the statues that were in the monuments in Richmond and others, I believe they belong in museums that explain how the statues came about. Because most of them did not come about from the Civil War, it was many years later. And they represented segregation, they represented racism, and the stories of the statues are very important. We live in Maryland, and this has become a major issue about statues. And I advocate for this kind of dialogue, that people see the statues and realize why they came about, why they engendered this outrage, as I pointed out, from Union veterans, why the Lee statue remained so long in the Capitol, which is really remarkable, and why the state of Virginia finally made the decision it did to remove it, and remove it for the preference of a great civil rights leader, as other places have been.
And Brian asked, how do you account for the lack of resolve or backbone by the GAR to resist the statue?
That is a great question. I think it's a couple of things. The rank and file was not nearly as conservative as the leadership. And it was also 1910. Reconciliation had taken hold. Don't forget, the Supreme Court had sanctioned Jim Crow through Plessy versus Ferguson. There have been wars that have been fought. The concept of what the war had been fought about had changed. And the perception about Robert E. Lee had changed, as I pointed out. He became a symbol of something in some ways he really had not been. And they were very concerned about backlash against those members in the former Confederate states. As I pointed out, not one department in any former Confederate state had any protest against the Lee statue, whereas every department in every other place was vehement in their opposition to the statue. So I think it was a combination of a lot of these different aspects, and it really spelled the end, if you will. I mean, it existed as an organization for decades after that, but it really lost its prestige and its moral stance that they had had for decades. I mean, they were advocates for African American freedom. They were a constant source of, again, in those days, the Republicans were the progressive arm. And even though the Grand Army was stated to be apolitical, everybody knew they were advocating for progressive Republican causes. And that started to change over time to its detriment. Other
And
questions?
Jim responded and said the statue is at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, which is what I thought, but I wasn't 100% sure. So
So again, I was right. There was another, but it wasn't your right. It was another.
right.
And again, I think that's terrific. And I don't know what the discussion will be. Hopefully they can use some of my material, because I think it's a very important point to discuss how it happened and what's happened now with it.
And then another person asked whether you did any research to look at how Southerners felt about the statue of Lee.
No, because this book is about Union veterans, and
right.
There are disproportionately much more works about Confederate soldiers in the Confederacy than there are about Union. This wasn't about this was not. I mean, the state of Virginia had spoken, and the state of Virginia supported this. That was very clear. My interest, frankly, was what the men who had fought against the Confederacy had to say. And frankly, I think their opinion matters more than anybody's. And that's why I mentioned the difference between the upper echelon. That's why I started with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and Grant. The common Northern soldier never felt about Lee the way some of his opposing generals did. And that was during the war. Matter of fact, they were outraged at the idea that people believed that Robert E. Lee was defeating the Army of the Potomac. They felt that Robert E. Lee was defeating the generals of the Army of the Potomac, not the Army of the Potomac. And when you read the commentaries, when they finally cornered Lee at Appomattox, I mean, don't forget, these were two great armies. I mean, these are two of the finest armies in military history, the Army of the Potomac and Northern Virginia. They fought it out for 4 years, but the Army of the Potomac was easily the equal of the Army of Northern Virginia, and they eventually defeated them. And Grant did talk about that in his memoirs, that when he came east and took command, he had to get rid of the concept that Robert E. Lee was invincible, and convince. Now, believe me, the Army of the Potomac, the men knew that was the case. Some of the generals didn't.
And Rhonda asked, did the resolution to remove the Lee statue come about after January 6th?
Boy, that's a great question. It was 2020, but I think it was towards the end of the year. Wasn't it December 2020? I don't know if I can make that link. I have to say it is part of what has been going on for the last several years about looking at Confederate statues, the renaming of bases named for Confederate generals, which is ongoing. Again, very, very healthy discussion of this. I think it was more an aspect of that. I don't know if I can make the direct link to January 6th.
And Daniel wanted to know, are there Confederate capitals in the statue, or Confederate statues in the Capitol today?
In terms of statuary,
Statuary,
yeah, that's a very good question. I don't believe so, because I will check on that. I mean, it is sardonic when they talked about putting in John Brown next to Lee statue. I thought it was a great idea. And and by the way, this was not a facetious comparison. They compared Lee to Benedict Arnold. And I don't think they were wrong that the Benedict Arnold statue would never have been placed in the Capitol. I will also point out that the law was obscure. Many people had no idea there was even such a law that existed in terms of that. So no one
And
saw.
can I ask why that law was passed? Did you do research into why the law was passed at that time?
You know, that is a great question. It's not really clear. And this was 1864. The war hadn't been settled. You know, Lincoln's reelection was hardly secure. That is a great question. And of all things, it was July 2nd. Presumptively, it would have been a celebration of independence. Presumptively, it would have been another establishment of the primacy of the federal government. Nobody could have imagined that Robert E. Lee would be one of the people. And as I mentioned, he was right next to two of Union generals. And the other statue that Virginia chose was George Washington. I would wonder what George Washington would have thought of Lee's statue being put next to him.
Yeah,
and particularly being made taller than he was.
and Brian says, our contemporary views would suggest that things have changed and people are more confrontational and inflammatory than in the past, but this kind of topic encapsulating all the disappointment and heartbreak of veterans and Blacks illustrates very well that there have always been dysfunctional elements who have powers and influence. That's just a
I
comment.
certainly agree with that. But let me point out that my book has two things that have never been told before. Not just the Lee statue, by the way. It's the story of the political activism of Black and white Union veterans during Reconstruction and later. That's not a story that's been told before. And secondly, they established what veterans since have emulated, that when men and women return from war, their obligation in a republic is just the same as during war. That things you fight for in peacetime can be exactly what you fought for during war, and sometimes even more. And of course, one of the great examples is our current climate representative is John Kerry. And in his wonderful book, Every Day is Extra, he talks about having survived war. And of course, he was a decorated, a Silver Star and Bronze Star awardee, a swiftboat captain in Vietnam. He dedicated his life to public service because he survived. And he felt he owed it to those who did not survive to serve a life of purpose. That is exactly what the men, Black and white, of the Union did. And that's not a story that's been told before. So the question that individual asked, their protest was against Jim Crow, North and South, above and below the Mason-Dixon line. And they were extremely effective in their advocacy for the 14th and 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Acts, which were later struck down by the Supreme Court, the use of the courts in the northern states and border states. It's quite a story, and it's been very exciting to write that. And so, again, I hope when people read the book, they see it in its totality. I mean, it's great to talk about the Lee statue, but the Lee statue was sort of an end of what had gone on previously. And their outrage at the failure of Reconstruction and then what came after that. It was all part and parcel of some of the same things. These are great questions, by the way. Are there more, I hope?
Let's see, that's what I'm looking. There's some comments in the chat. Talking about where the Virginia Museum of History and Culture is located in response to the UDC. Someone comments that Lee's statue was removed in response to the killing of George Floyd, not January 6th.
Right. Yeah. Again, that which was my understanding. Yes. And again, that was also the reevaluation. There's that great quote in 1776, attributed to Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island, that there's nothing that can't be debated, and which I loved. I love the play. And these issues should be debated. I mean, these are things, but with knowledge that people's rights to opinions But the men of the Union not only believed in the law, they believed that the laws of the United States should be used to further the goals of the United States in terms of opportunity for all Americans. The use of the law to enable people to have equal opportunity. There were two main things that Union veterans, black and white, were looking for equality. One was social equality. The other was equality of education, equality of opportunity. And again, when hopefully you read the book and you see, it is remarkable what they did. And by the way, not just in the South, we're talking Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, many other places, because the laws passed during Reconstruction were federal, so that the impact north of the Mason-Dixon line was major, including border states like my home state of Maryland. And that's, again, not something that people really have talked about. And that's one of the things I emphasize in the book, is that the use of the courts became so important when it came for equal education opportunities. And again, the Midwestern states like Ohio and Illinois, which had black codes that were struck down, suddenly were integrating the schools. That opened up a lot of things. And that was a direct result of many of the legislative efforts that came through Reconstruction and after.
And there is one more question that I had missed from Karen, wanting to know about Lee's descendants and how they feel. Did you happen to delve into that or interview anybody?
It took me 20 years to do the research for this and 2 other books I'm planning to publish. No, I didn't. Yeah, I don't know. I saw something about, there was a recent article about, if I'm not mistaken, there was a great meeting of Lee's descendants with people who had been enslaved at Arlington. I think it was a couple of months ago, and it was actually, it was very moving. It was in the Washington Post. That they've become very tight about the presentation of history at Arlington. And they didn't mention the Lee statue in that, but the article was terrific. And I think that was maybe a month and a half ago. So I think there is something ongoing now. And again, I think that's marvelous in terms of that kind of use of history, and then focusing on where we go from there. Because I believe as history teaches us about our now and about the future. That's why I study history.